My name is Austin Roos, president of CFAM. Stefano Gennarini, the director of legal studies for CFAM, is sitting right over there in New York City. And we are delighted to have an old friend on the program today, Professor Robert Destro, who I've known for years and years. He was a professor of law at Catholic University of America. And then for a few years was the head of one of the largest and most important bureaus at the United States State Department. And we're going to talk a lot about that. But I want to go back in history just a little bit, Bob, because CFAM is at the UN full time. A lot of people that we know have been introduced to the UN for the very first time as one of our guests. And I think of Pat Cipollone, who was general counsel to the president, the head of the head legal counsel at the White House during the Trump administration, who has many secrets, none of which he will ever tell. And he came to the United Nations for the very first time with us when he was with the Knights of Columbus. And I was just thinking about talking to you today, and I remember David Coolidge of fond memory, who was one of your colleagues at Catholic University, worked on religious freedom issues, came to the United Nations for the very first. I remember sitting with David Coolidge and watching a negotiation. And I'm wondering, did you come to the United Nations for the first time with us around the David Coolidge era, or did you come at some other time?
You know, I'm trying to remember. It's been a long time. I think it was before you guys.
Yeah.
You know, but there were times when I was lurking around your office in New York as well. And you know, it's that's a whole other topic of you know, what we'll get into hopefully today.
How much do we miss David Coolidge?
Oh, I mean, I miss David all the time. He and I were really good friends. We used to commute together, and I still stay in touch with his wife Joni, and some of the kids. And I mean, he was just it was just a devastating loss. You know, when he basically died of brain cancer.
That's right. You know, and I remember so well, it was one of those situations where, you know, he came home for hospice care in the front, you know, in the living room in his hospital bed. And it was just like a very moving experience for all those that were involved. He was a good and great man.
Yeah, he really was. And I remember when he first, you know, when he was first trying to figure out what was wrong with him.
Yeah.
And when we got the diagnosis, I called a friend who was a neurologist, and he got very quiet on the other end of the phone. And I said, "What's the story?" He goes, "Bob, this is like a nuclear weapon going off in your head." He says, "Unfortunately," he said, "it is. He will be completely aware of everything until the end." He says, "You can't operate," he says, "because the cancer, which he called an astrocytoma, was," he says, "it's like the blue in blue cheese. It just kind of goes, you know, throughout your brain. So there's nothing we can really do about it."
Yeah. Yeah. I remember very well sitting in one of those galleries, Stefano, that you know so well, with David, and he was sitting there cracking wise about the sometimes silly negotiations that go on at the United Nations. I remember that very, very well. Right. So Bob Destro also traveled the world working on human rights issues, and I believe you went to the Middle East several times. Is that right?
I did. Yep. You know, I've been to. I was the only person in the State Department who'd ever been to Iran more than once.
And lived to tell about it. Can you talk about a little bit about what you were doing in Iran those many years ago?
You know, I mean, it's basically I'm still in touch with a lot of people there. It's basically using faith as a common ground. You know, and we thought, you know, as one of my very good friends put it, he says, you know, if you want to talk to the Iranians about anything, they won't talk to you. He says, but if you want to talk to them about religion, they will talk to you about literally anything. And the fact of the matter is that's true. It's one of the reasons why the UN is both completely ineffectual in some respects, and like a battering ram culturally in other respects. Because for all of the blather we have about respect for diversity and culture, there's very little respect for where people are coming from.
One of my favorite stories was going to Venezuela, riding in the back of a car. We were going to a planning meeting for the World Congress of Families, and I was sitting in the back seat of this car talking to, and I think, as I recall, an Iranian, and I was Muslim, and I was talking about all the things that we have in common as Christians and Muslims. You know, you know, you think very highly of the Blessed Mother. In fact, you have an entire book of the Quran giving her names, and I went down the list of you think that, you know, Jesus is the second highest prophet, not the highest, but the second highest, and so on and so forth. And I said, and you also believe that Jesus is going to return at the end of time. And I said, for what purpose? And he stuck a bony finger in my face and said, to tell the Christians they were wrong.
You know, that would be about right. Yeah, that's right.
Well, I found out subsequently that that's precisely why they believe Jesus will come at the end of time, is to tell the Christians they were wrong. And it was such a funny, beautiful moment. It's been a very satisfying many years in working with the Muslims at the UN. Wouldn't you say, right, Stefano?
Oh, absolutely. It's they can be incredibly reasonable, especially when compared to diplomats from Western countries nowadays who are so woke and seem simply incapable of any kind of compromise or even the ability to simply reason anymore.
You know, it's a very interesting thing when you know, a so-called thug state is placed on the UN Human Rights Council and the Human Rights Committee, and there's a Sturm und Drang about it. And I point out to people that the human rights regime at the United Nations was sullied a long time ago, and not in just the way that, you know, that the Muslims may do wrong things with regard to voting or freedom of the press or whatever, but the metastasizing of human rights has sullied the broad scope of human rights in the United Nations. You know, years ago, during one of these conferences, we had so many volunteers that we put out a daily newspaper, and somebody took a picture of one of the public meetings, and in that picture was a woman who was the representative of the Girl Scouts and radical feminist, and she complained to us that we had run her picture in the newspaper without her permission, even though she was at a public meeting. And she said that her human rights had been violated. So, Bob, can you talk a little bit about how human rights have become so diluted that the traditional understanding of human rights have been harmed?
Well, I would probably approach it just a little tiny bit differently.
All right.
This is one of the themes that I tried to use as I was when I was assistant secretary, is that it's time, we really need desperately to put the human back in human rights. You know, that when you say, you know, what was the phrase you just used? Why are they so what? Again, what was the phrase you used? So diluted, I think.
I diluted, sullied. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, I mean, what they've been, what has happened is that we have divorced them from their root in human nature. I mean, the idea that human rights are based on our common humanity is, at least the idea is that, like, look, the inalienable rights, right? The big debate that we had over Marianne Glendon's and Mike Pompeo's Inalienable Rights Commission.
Right.
I mean, you know, one side only wanted to talk about the rights, you know, but nobody wants to talk about the human part. You know, and they put there's this false dichotomy between economic rights and kind of basic human rights. You know, and you know, I am completely convinced that that's completely wrong. Is that, you know, but growing up as a human rights lawyer, as a civil rights lawyer, especially in the First Amendment context, you know, we would always talk about what is the value of free speech in a democratic society. You know, what is the role? You know, why do we have a jury trial? You know, why do we have a right to private property? And the answer is, first and foremost, the reason we have a right to free speech is because we're human beings and we communicate with each other at many different levels, not simply vocally, but also, you know, there's all kinds of nonverbal communication, written communication. That's what we do as human beings. That's what the whole discussion about parental rights is about. It's wait a minute, this most fundamental relationship there is the relationship between parents and children. Mm-hmm. You know, the very fact that there is you can't have kids by having a platonic relationship. I mean, that's simply the nature of things. You know, the whole right to, if we look at the international arms control regime, you know, it's almost like the discussion of guns in Chicago. It's like, well, we got to get the guns off the table. No, wait. Let's talk about the human right to self-defense. You know, and let's talk about the right to communicate. Let's talk about the fact that if I don't have a right to control the property that I own, that I develop with my own labor, that I can't sell it, that I can't lease it, that I can't do any of those other things, then I'm a slave. Mm-hmm. And Pope John Paul II in that series of encyclicals that started with Rerum Novarum, but wound up with Sanctissimus Annus and Laborum Exercens. Those are all about what various people have called homo faber, man the worker. You know, and the only thing a worker has is his labor. And so when Biden gets up on television yesterday and says, we're going to take the money of those oligarchs, you say, excuse me, but who died and left you in charge of somebody else's property? It's one thing for you to say, he stole the money and we're going to get it back to its rightful owner. You know, but you got to show it was stolen. Mm-hmm. You know, and that's what happened with Justin Trudeau in Canada and the truckers, where he says, oh, I'm going to take your money. You know, he caused a run on the banks. Why? Because you're taking the humanity out of human rights. You know, and the idea that a big tech company like BlackRock or Facebook or whomever, you know, that we are dependent on them for communication. It's like, that's just not human. I mean, that's just like, wait a minute, you know, I have my relationships, you have your relationships. It's none of your business what we talk about. That's the other part of the First Amendment. It's just none of your business. You know, where did that go? And that's if we go back to an understanding of human rights as what humans do naturally, then a lot of this other stuff starts to make sense, and attacking it, attacking the way in which basically these corporate interests that run the international organizations and other organizations begins to make much more sense.
In light of what you just said, can you talk a little bit about what seems to us to be an exponential growth of new human rights? Because that's what we are dealing with at the United Nations, and I think that's what the Pompeo Marion Glendon Committee was supposed to do. Can you talk a little bit about the metastasizing of human rights and why they don't necessarily fit into what you just described?
Well, you know, let's put it this way: it's not about human rights. All right. You know, none of this discussion is about human rights. It's all about control. You know, and the idea that probably one of the best renditions of this I've ever heard was by the late Professor Robert Cover of Yale, who talked about in a speech he gave here at Catholic University back in 1987, which has been published, and I can send the link around to it. It's called the Religious Foundation of Human Rights Law or Civil Rights Law. Mm-hmm. And he talked about the difference between the Jewish approach Jewish law's approach to human rights and Western law approach to human rights. And he put it very succinctly this way. He says, in the West, human rights are viewed as trump cards. He says, they're trumps in a legal game. And basically, I put my right to whatever, sexual identity or free speech, and you have to shut up. You know, and if you think about this whole thing about disinformation and misinformation, you know, the whole idea of hate speech is I get to define what it is. I get to tell you to shut up if I don't like what you have to say. Right. And even in its more extreme sense, it's if I'm offended, then you have to shut up.
Right.
Okay. And that's the idea of a human right as a trump, or more importantly, as a claim against others. Okay. And the Robert Cover, who was, you know, absolutely a brilliant guy, who was one of Martin Luther King's chief lieutenants, when he was really just kind of a young law student at Harvard, he says the Jewish law notion and the Islamic law notion is not much different, really. They use different language, but in Jewish law, the closest idea is mitzvah. You know, the idea of an incumbent obligation. You know, that which you are obliged to do. And so, to a Jewish law scholar, when you say I have a right to education, then that means, well, don't talk to me about the right to education. Talk to me about who's going to provide it. You know, I have a right to free speech. Okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to listen. You know, I mean, so this idea of where is your if I have a right to free speech, then that means you have an obligation to allow me to speak as long as I'm complying with certain time, place, and manner restrictions. And so this idea that somehow, some way, so all of this stuff is claims on the rest of us. You know, but what about us? Don't we count? I mean, do we just become kind of players in somebody else's game, or are we players in our own game? And this is in Islamic law, the general concept is more looked at under the rubric of justice. What does a just outcome look like? And in this discussion of when you talk about the human rights discussion, it's always only one-sided. Everything has to bow to whatever that narrative is.
Let's digress for just a second. We talked about it before we went live, and that is the question of free speech, the tech oligarchs. I have a specific question before we go down that road about the recent appointment, the standing up of this new committee at the Department of Health, Department of Homeland Services on misinformation. It seems, I hate to use this word because it's a word of the left, but it seems kind of scary to me.
Yeah, I mean, you know, use a different word. You know, and the reason I say that is it's totalitarian. Yeah. This is Stalinism. You know, and as I was walking across campus today, I was thinking, how do I figure out who is on that list? Because that's what they're doing. They're putting together a list. Yeah. And you know, and I want to find out who's on that list so that we can go sue their pants off. You know, because the fact is that that's surveillance. I mean, what we're doing is we're looking at the surveillance state, and there is a fabulous little article. Again, I'll have to. I don't have access to it right now, but I will. You know, if you send me a list of all the questions that people have, I'll send the stuff back to you. But there's a great little article called Jack's Magic Coffee Shop. And it's all about, you know, Jack Dorsey, obviously, and how it's been impossible for other people to replicate the business model of Twitter. because Twitter, unlike Facebook, is basically not selling you anything. You know, and in Facebook or Google, you are the product. They're selling your eyeballs, and then they're monetizing your clicks, and they're monetizing your content. And you know, but Twitter doesn't do any of that. And so, you know, there's no income unless they're selling the data that they're generating about you and everybody who responds to it to a very big bidder. Or even more sinisterly, maybe the backbone of Twitter is actually the government. You know, and when you see the meltdown over what Elon Musk is doing, you know, there's no way, you know, one of the things that's so interesting about this little article is that there's no way, given the current business model, that Twitter can make money unless it's monetizing that data in ways that blur the distinction, if not obliterate it, between intelligence agencies and the private sector.
You know, there's an organization called NewsGuard, which is run by Stephen Brill.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And apparently NewsGuard sent some sort of notice to a website called Gray Zone, which is run by a nasty little leftist.
Yes, I heard about this.
Yes, and the nasty little leftist, whose name is escaping me, basically told him to go jump in a lake, in stronger terms than that. But yet NewsGuard seems to be a part of this. Tucker Carlson proposed that NewsGuard, and NewsGuard is full of these national security state type people and corporate heads and things like that.
Yeah, no, this is we live in, you know, we live in a surveillance state, and we've allowed it to happen. You know, you know, we don't know, you know, like if a government were to put together a website like Facebook and said, oh, why don't you tell us all your most personal things? Let's tell us, you know, tell us who your brother-in-law is cheating on. You know, tell us, you know, why you don't like your mother-in-law. I mean, you know, you'd say, this is run by the Department of Homeland Security. There's no way I'm going to get involved in that. Well, then, you know, well, you know, who knows? I mean, that you don't think nobody's listening to that?
Let me ask you a question. Over the last few years in watching the behavior of the national security state, I've become a little bit radicalized from what I was, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. Particularly when I look at the FBI, the CIA, and other organizations like that. Have recent years affected you this way, or have you always had your eyes open?
Well, probably not. I mean, there was a time when I thought the Patriot Act was a good idea.
Right.
You know, I'm not convinced of that anymore.
Right.
You know, when I went back and I look at the hermetic division between what the Supreme Court considers to be the private sector and the government sector. And, you know, having been inside the government now, I'd say, I'm sorry, I don't see the distinction anymore. You know, that the government doesn't do things on its own. It uses contractors for everything.
Oh, right.
You know, and so when I was at the UN in December of 2019, I was on a panel with my former colleague, Rick Grinnell.
Yep.
And Rick is one of the most interesting, smart, funny, you know, people. And he makes no bones about where he's coming from on anything.
Yep.
And he pulled me aside after the session. And he said, you know, all those people who just beat you up, he said, do you understand that they're on your payroll? And I just kind of looked at him and I said, what are you talking about? He says, every single one of their organizations is funded by DRL. And
just to be clear, this was an event. I was there at that event and also got to speak to Rick Grinnell a little bit. Anyway, so this was an event where Rick Grinnell was announcing Trump campaign to promote decriminalization of homosexuality to the whole world. And so it was basically Rick Grinnell in asking other governments and the LGBT activists of the entire world to sort of moderate their position.
Right.
Let's not ask for the whole trans thing. Let's not ask for the whole panoply of the LGBT alphabet soup. Let's just agree that we want to not criminalize homosexuality in any country, and let's have a strong campaign focused just on this. And the response that he got was a slap in the face from the EU, from the Nordic governments, and from the activists from all around the world.
Right.
And this is and they're all getting money from the United States, including a lot of money from PEPFAR, which is the largest single government foreign policy grant in the world.
No, and when you and that really was one of the eye openers. I mean, I learned a lot more in the course of my time there, but that was a bit of an eye opener by itself. And I have to say, and until I got into the State Department, I really had not been that focused like you guys are on the international organization side, or as we say on the inside in the IO space. And I thought, oh man, I mean, you know, the fact that you guys get as much done as you do, you know, is pretty staggering when you consider that the people on the other side are all funded by governments.
Yeah.
And they're funded by governments and by major corporations.
Yeah.
And so and whether or not any of that is actually legal, I don't know. It's something that we need to start exploring. But the idea that as the first lady of a country which will remain nameless asked me at a breakfast a while back. She says, "What is your country's foreign policy toward my country?" And I, without missing a beat, I just looked at her and I said, "We don't have one." And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Seriously," I said, what you have at the State Department is a massive bureaucracy that nobody talks to each other. And the people at USAID and state sometimes talk to each other, you know, and sometimes they talk with the arms control people, and sometimes they talk to the agriculture people. But if you really want to know what our foreign policy is toward your country, then you need to have a list of every single grant and contract and contractor who's operating on the ground in your country. And once you put that mosaic together, then you will figure out what the policy is. And I will guarantee you that it will be incomprehensible.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, seriously. And
yeah.
so when a good friend of mine in Central America said that, you know, her government was, you know, the ambassador came over and said, you have to legalize same-sex marriage, you know, and she said, who died and left you in charge of our domestic policy? You know, and it's like, well, we'll take your money away. Look at what just happened with Poland and Hungary. The election comes out the wrong way, so, you know, we're going to take your aid away. Yep. You know, and, you know, so it is, so, you know, when I said to you, you know, read, there's a new book out by a great young professor at Cornell, whose name is Nicholas Mulder, M-U-L-D-E-R. I mentioned this to Stefano the other day. His book is called The Economic Weapon. And it's all about the history of sanctions. You know, but somewhere in the book, he kind of drops a line that he doesn't really continue. I want to do an interview like this with him. You know, but foreign assistance is the other side of sanctions. If we can't compel your acquiescence, we're going to buy it.
Right.
And that's what, and it's all the use of money as a weapon.
Well, in answer to your very kind assertion that you wonder how we can get so much done, we do get a lot done when it comes to the negotiations of documents. But
Right.
where we lose outright is in the spending of money, and in the pressure that governments put on other governments, in the pressure that UN agencies. I mean, UN agencies go their own way.
Right.
There is a very solid definition of gender in international law, in the Rome statutes of the International Criminal Court. The definition is men and women in the context of society. The UN bureaucracy completely ignores that and says that gender is a social construct and blah, blah, blah. So,
Right.
it's like we are able to negotiate documents, but we lose outright in how those documents are then implemented around the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's the and that's why I say that I think, based on what I've learned, we've got to change our strategy a bit.
Yeah.
And especially as we're dealing with some of our friends in other country. I see Ms. Amali is in from Nigeria. I mean, Nigeria is one of the countries that Secretary Pompeo put me, he says, look, make sense of Nigeria for me. And I said, that's a tall order, but the fact is that I've stayed very closely in touch with many of my friends in Nigeria, and the way we deal, the way even we advocate is the wrong way, because we're not understanding that the forces arrayed against you are, like I said, it's amazing you get done what you get done.
Yeah.
But you have to understand that these people are not fostering local values.
Yeah.
They're not, they're fostering the values of the people who pay them.
Yeah.
And I've really, I've become, if you said you became radical, I've become far more radical in some respects, in part because it's like, that's not what Hungarian or Finnish or other taxpayers are putting their money into. I remember sitting at a lengthy conversation. I felt like the net at a tennis match in a conversation among Portuguese about the accession of Portugal to the European Union. Mm-hmm. And finally, I finally said, what I don't understand is, why do you think the European Union is even a democratic entity? I says, what does the parliament actually do? And the answer is it debates, but can it vote? Can it actually vote to overturn what the commission says? And the answer is no. Yeah. So what you've got is the perfect marriage of German efficiency and French centralism. Yep. And with no accountability whatsoever. And so we need to be figuring out in the process of putting together coalitions, how do we empower coalitions with information about where the money's going?
So Stefano, let me ask you, Stefano, a question. How do we gather coalitions during negotiations at the United Nations? And don't give away too many of our secrets.
Well, it really depends on who's here in New York. I mean, what will happen is, what happens here in New York is, as with most diplomatic posts, they never last more than 3 or 4 years. So you've got a steady continuum of delegates cycling through here, and we sort of, we analyze documents for them. We meet them. We organize conferences and events.
We look for friends.
We make friends. And we sort of train them and we teach them, we should give them our experience. We have a lot of institutional knowledge, having been here at the United Nations for a quarter of a century. And so we're able to share that with them. Many times these delegates come here and they have no clue about the issues they're negotiating. They come to what's called the third committee of the the General Assembly, which deals with humanitarian affairs, human rights, etc. And they may have never had the human rights portfolio in any of their previous postings. And so it's all new to them, including, the technical debates about sexual and reproductive health and what the term multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and all the, and there's usually an acronym for all of these wonderful terms. And sometimes the difference in an acronym is just one letter and it changes the entire meaning. So And so, so what we do is we work with all the delegates who will work with us, and we generally reach out to them based on their voting, based on their voting, their declarations in the public meetings. And generally you will see that, when there is a delegate who's willing to speak, they're the ones who are going to be the most helpful.
Stefano, who was the fabulous Nigerian ambassador for all those years?
Sarki, Usman Sarki.
Sarki,
He was a great diplomat, very courageous, and a leader, yes. And while he was here, the African group had a really strong position on a lot of the controversial social issues, including promoting the family. You'll see that the African group still has some pro-life, pro-family positions, and they'll take positions, but they're not able to defend them anymore as well. And many times it's not just a matter of political will. It's also a lack of capacity and technical capacity.
Years ago, Bob, we had a meeting at the State Department. I think it was, I forget exactly what administration, and we were proposing something to do with global health. And we had this great idea, and we were a bunch of rank amateurs in there with a room full of State Department experts. And within like 5 minutes, they blew us out of the water. And that's the problem that Stefano is expressing now, is you sit in a room with people who have huge institutional memory, that have big UN agencies behind them whispering in their ears, and they simply know language that our guys don't know and might learn over 3 or 4 years at the United Nations, and then they go home. So it's just like that meeting that we had in the State Department. It was like we were just outclassed almost immediately.
Well, that's because you were playing their game. And, and like I say, I sat in a meeting at the State Department where I said, hey, look, I've been working on this country for quite a long time, and there's a ton of material that you have. Can you let me know what it is that has been useful and what wasn't? And what I realized is that after all those years of briefing people, nobody ever looked at it. And
that's so painful.
Well, but again, your point, Stefano's point, is that they leave every few years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's also what's happening at the State Department.
Yeah,
people
with the
are moving
political
around. And so there's no institutional memory.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like 52 first dates. I mean, you're always telling the story over and over again, and what we, one of the other things I think our listeners need to understand is that, at least from an American foreign policy perspective, the ambassador is the point of the spear. Mm-hmm. And so even if you have a huge groundswell of people in Washington in Foggy Bottom, if the ambassador doesn't want to do it, it ain't going to get done. And so whoever is at USUN is in charge of she or he is the maestro that's conducting the orchestra. And if the orchestra is not with him or her, it'll be a solo. And so what some of what we need to be doing is empowering people in their home countries to basically provide the wherewithal to the ambassador at the UN, so that they can then get in the face of the ambassadors who are giving them a hard time. And so, what we often think about in terms of grassroots politics, we don't apply, at your level, because, still all politics is local. And if we can't counteract them, at least we can make life difficult for them.
Well, and expressing these ideas on the ground around the world, especially in Africa and Latin America, is really difficult.
Well, it is, but one thing I can tell you for sure is that everybody understands money.
Yeah.
And everybody understands that if you look at all the needs in a country, in a country like Nigeria, and again, I'm picking Nigeria not because it's a particularly, it's because I know a lot about it, is, if you were to show the average Nigerian what the United States is spending money on in Nigeria, they would be annoyed. And the same thing would be true for the UK. I sat in meetings about, physical security of people, and the on the ground perspective of diplomats is very different oftentimes than in Whitehall. So it is we really need to think about what a grassroots CFIM, strategy looks like. Yeah. Because there's only so much you can do. The cake is already baked by the time it arrives in New York.
Yeah. How did they like you at the State Department?
That's almost an irrelevant question. And because it's not about whether they like you or not. I have to say, the people that I worked with, I liked a lot.
Yeah.
Very, very hardworking people, but also very much this is a massive bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So when you listen to the discussions of how did we withdraw from Afghanistan, classic bureaucracy. There was nobody in charge. And so when you look at the question of I had one of the people I really liked a lot. She and I didn't agree on a whole lot of things, but boy, I learned a ton from her. Yeah. And she would look me straight in the eye and she said, "Do you believe there's a deep state?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." I said, "Now, whether or not you're a member of it depends on how you act."
Right.
And what you mean by deep state is it's actually not it should not be viewed as a pejorative. It should actually be viewed as a functional question, which is who are these people accountable to?
Right.
And if the answer is to nobody but themselves, then they're deep state. And what I mean by that is that you have nobody is looking over their shoulders. Some of the biggest battles I fought inside the State Department among people who politically are indistinguishable in terms of their policy perspectives is, did the policy people, were they allowed to see where the money goes from the programming people? And in DRL in particular, the answer was no. And if you want to look at and to take it completely out of this context and put it into health and human services, Tony Fauci and Francis Collins, did not give the policy committees of the Congress the time of day. They went directly to the appropriators. And so if you look at the federal government, it's got a policy side and it's got a programming side. Most people actually think that it makes a difference to talk about the policy. How many people are being killed? Maybe, but if you want to know where the action is, you got to go to the funding side. And and like I said, it reflects, the appropriations versus authorization side of the hill. Right. And so, and a lot of the action happens on appropriations bills. And that's where, who actually runs the deep state? I would suggest to you that it's a combination of the bureaucracy and Hill staff, because the Hill staff is directing the bureaucracy to where the money goes. And the revolving door, just figuring out who used to work for whom and where they're working for now, that's every bit as big as the revolving door between law firms, the lobbying firms, and the Hill.
My next area of inquiry is about the Universal Periodic Review, which your bureau was deeply involved in.
Right.
We followed this during the Obama administration, where the United States was putting pressure on governments in areas that are not recognized human rights. And we kind of hoped that would stop under the Trump administration. People are a little bit shocked that it didn't. But I mean, this has to do with the disconnect between the politicals and the people that are there all the time. Can you talk a little bit about the lack of control that the politicals had in something like the Universal Periodic Review?
Well, you have to understand that the process is a long one. So and everybody knows everybody.
Yeah.
So the political comes in, and the first thing that you're told is, well, you can't do that. And there's
right.
there's no assistant secretary 101 training. So nobody tells you what you can actually stamp your feet and do. And if it hadn't been for a very good friend who said, look, I'm just a deputy assistant secretary and people listen to me. He says, as an assistant secretary, you have almost cosmic powers, and I was like, no, come on. And there's a situation that is about to go public. I can't talk about it now, where basically I just stamped my feet and I said, I don't want to hear no, I want it done. And eventually it got done, but I have to tell you, people hate you for it. Right. Because they've got their own priorities. And so unless you think about the State Department or USAID or Justice or Agriculture, these are bureaucracies that have long-term relationships with organizations, with contractors, and with foreign governments. And so the idea, it's almost, the politicals are almost more like mosquitoes that you have to swat.
Yeah.
And every time there is a transition, that group gets stronger. And every time you hold up a nominee on the Hill, the group gets stronger because they're not supervised. And the idea that you would, as somebody told me, I said, well, this information isn't classified. Anybody can file a FOIA for it, the FOIA Freedom of Information Act request. And the person's response to me, and I quote, is, anybody who would do a FOIA on these programs would be evil, unquote. And so, but that's what accountability is.
Well, we followed and we reported on what happened to Mary Stoll. Is that her name, Stefano?
Yeah, Mary Stoll.
And her boss, who was her boss at IO who got the treatment also?
Kevin, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah.
Kevin Moley.
Yeah.
So they not only do they have the ability to stall, they have the ability to really destroy you.
Well, they do, and but most of the time it's done by control of information, and as Stefano was talking about the decriminalization meeting that they had at the UN that Rick Grinnell chaired. The fact is that it was very, very difficult to get the staff on board because they weren't interested in a less, in a more measured way to do things. And if you actually would get into the money that was being spent on it, it was so far beyond that. It was, basically you were asking people, they said, look, we're driving the train here, and you politicals just, you get on and off periodically, but the train doesn't slow down.
I want to digress a little bit with regard to Rick Grinnell and what he was doing. And I'm sorry I didn't pick this up earlier, but I mean, I don't think that he approached that in a measured way. I mean, he was threatening governments and it went far beyond the death penalty for homosexual behavior.
Right.
It had to do with, the sexual regulation and things like that. And I take no position on that right now. But I mean, I think that he harmed our relationships with some countries by going in such an unmeasured fashion. And I don't necessarily want to put you on the spot on that. But that was one of our frustrations as an organization with Rick Grinnell, because he was threatening our relation, the pro-life activity at the United Nations was harmed with how strong he was going on kind of a private issue for him.
Well, to be fair to Rick, like I say, I think Rick is absolutely brilliant. He's more fun than a barrel of monkeys. He's very strategic in his thinking, but and here's the big, if I had said to you, was there any high-level policy development discussion on how to approach that issue? The answer is absolutely not.
Yeah,
there was no discussion.
Yeah.
Now, is that the only issue? No. I mean, it's on everything. And that's what I just said to the first lady of the country I was talking about.
Right.
Is there, what is the policy?
Yeah.
What is, if you were to, I actually asked a working group within the State Department, what does a good outcome for this country look like? I mean, what is a good outcome for us as the United States? What's a good outcome for them? And people looked at me like I was from Mars. They said, nobody's ever asked us that question. And it's because you want to know about the apple producers, and you want to know about the wheat crop, and you want to know about the labor market. And so it's basically that, why do you need a primary care physician? Because he's looking at the whole person.
Right.
We don't have that.
Yeah.
And when you look at, I invite you to think carefully about the way in which the United States is using sanctions. There seems to be this notion, that's why I mentioned Nicholas Mulder's book. There seems to be this notion that if you don't do things the way we want you to do, we're going to sanction, which is exactly what Rick was suggesting.
Yeah.
Now, during a conversation I had with a foreign minister, I said, well, look, I'm going to ask you for something at the end, but in the meantime, let's talk about our two countries and what we can be doing together. And the staff afterwards said, well, we thought you would really beat them up. And I said, well, aren't we supposed to be diplomats? I mean, and 2 weeks later, we got what we wanted. And they said, well, we were really surprised. So this idea is that we and a long time ago, J. William Fulbright wrote a book called The Arrogance of Power. And it was basically, we're the big kids on the block, so damn it, do what we want you to do. And that's just not the way, that's not diplomacy. And so what Rick was doing, is I understand why he was doing what he was doing. And I don't think people should be put to death, for sexual behavior either.
Right,
But the fact of the matter is, we got to get them, a good outcome is to get them to stop. Not to put a financial gun to their head and say, unless you stop, we're going to blow your brains out.
But you see, if Grinnell had simply said, we're going to stop the death penalty for this particular thing, we would have had no problem with it whatsoever. But he went far beyond that.
I would go further and say, I mean, and this is where the lack of a discussion and strategy really hurts you, is, you can make it an argument that, putting people in prison, other kinds of financial penalties are cruel and inhuman punishment for crimes of moral turpitude, right? There's certainly an argument there to be made that under even the obligations that the United States recognizes in international human rights, certain punishments are excessive. And that's an argument, that's a legal argument that can be made through appropriate channels. But to threaten sanctions and to declare that whoever you love is a basic human right is a different thing. That's promoting the notion of unfettered sexual autonomy, which is not an internationally recognized human rights.
Well,
The only kind of sexual autonomy that international human rights law recognizes is the right to freely marry and found a family, and that's in the context of men and women, and that's clearly defined in international law. So,
well, but you also need to think about the other side of this, which is one of the international human rights is a country's self-determination.
No, I actually,
We've got somebody claiming to be me, another screen up here, so I'm not sure where that's coming from. But I would ask you, Stefano, to step back a few steps and to look at this as a process, because look at what's going on in Ukraine right now, and just as a practical matter, and again, set aside the bad behavior of Vladimir Putin. And you say to the Germans, oh, by the way, you've got to stop using gas. It says, what, we're supposed to freeze to death in the dark? Russia and Belarus are some of the world's largest producers of potash, fertilizer. By interdicting, by sanctioning those agricultural commodities, millions of people are going to starve. Is this what we wanted? Is this the outcome we're looking for? And when we're looking at self-determination, if we believe seriously the country of Nowheresville actually has a right to cultural and religious and political self-determination, our job as diplomats is to convince the people there that that's the right policy. It's not to hold a gun to their heads, or not to say, oh, by the way, we're going to cancel all your agricultural, we're going to stop trading with you unless you do what we want you to do. Well, what happened to self-determination at that point? I mean, that's putting the human back in human rights. Do we believe in democracy or don't we? Or is it only when, is it when I was in law school, they used to call the one-way ratchet. It only goes one way. And our job is to convince people that the policy is more humane. And is this the way you should be treating your fellow citizens?
Right.
And if we can make an earnest argument that that's the case on human, grounds, then I think we will succeed over the long term.
I just want to chime in and say that, we've known Rick Grinnell since his first tour at the UN years ago, when he was the chief spokesman for a couple of US UN ambassadors in a row. And when he was named the chief foreign policy spokesman for candidate Romney, he came under severe attack from our friends among Christian conservatives, including our friends at the Family Research Council. And we came to his defense quite publicly. So we disagree with him on the approach that he took in this particular area, right. but not against the man himself. And speaking of personalities, how was Pompeo? I'm a big fan of his. And I thought that he might make a run for the presidency this next time around, but he's very much overshadowed by guys like Ron DeSantis and certainly Trump. He even lost weight for it. Anyway,
well, working with Mike Pompeo was a great honor.
Yeah.
And one of the things I can honestly say is the man is brilliant. Yeah. He as one of my foreign friends who had a lot of dealings with him in meetings that I sat in on, is he says, what I really like about Mr. Pompeo is that there's no pretense here. Mm-hmm. He listens, he asks really tough questions. And then, I literally, in one meeting we were in, I literally watched him grit his teeth when somebody said to him, well, Mr. Secretary, that's the ball game. And he just sat there and he goes, yeah, you're right. That's the ball game. Go ahead and do it. So there was no pretense. What you see is what you get. And you get decision. He's not one of these people who puts his finger up to see where the wind is going. He wants a good argument about why it's a good idea, or why it's a bad idea.
Yeah.
And he'll sit and he'll listen, and then he'll make his mind up. And I was at a lot of very interesting conversations with him as chair. And I have to tell you, very, very impressive guy.
Final question. Would you serve again?
Yeah, I mean, if I were asked, I would. Yeah. I would. It was almost, you get a little bit of basic training, and then I would know more what to do now.
Right.
And I mean, it would be an honor to do it, and it was quite an education. And in the meantime, these were your tax dollars at work, so you guys have got to figure out ways to put me to work. You paid for it.
Thank you so much for the past hour. We're very grateful to know you, and that you have joined us and the CFAM audience today talking about your work.
Well, thank you. And I think I sent out, Stefano, did you get the article?
Yeah,
I sent it out
it's
to everybody
posted in the chat box.
Yeah.
Oh, I see it in the chat box. By the way,
Yeah.
Teresa Collette says we would be lucky to have you back in that area of public service.
Oh, well, tell her, say hi. She knows some of the people I'm talking about.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Professor Robert Destro of Catholic University Law School, thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you, and have a good weekend.
Be well.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.